هیچ ئومێدێکەیە بەم زوانە ئێران وڵاتانی ڕۆژاوە لێک نزیک بنەوە و ڕێکەوتنامەی ئەتۆمی جارێکی دیکە کارابێتەوە و هەموو وڵاتان بگەڕێنە ناو ڕێکەوتنامەکە؟
Hi, and thanks for having me. Yes, absolutely. I think if you asked me the question just 3 months ago, the answer would have been a lot more negative. I think the narrative now has changed given the fact that the two sides are talking to each other again. They started speaking to each other not long ago. And from what we are hearing from Vienna, the talks are relatively promising. Now, I think there's still a relatively long road before we could reach an agreement, even though a breakthrough relatively quickly is also not out of the question. So it could also happen, but it's looking a lot more positive. And I think that we should expect this to happen. The question is more around when will this happen? Will this happen before the Iranian elections, which are supposed to take place next month? Or will this happen a bit later or in the second half of the year? But I think the question is more about when will this happen rather than if it will happen.
ئومێدێکەیە کە لە چارەکی چوارەمی ئەم ساڵدا واتە لە مانگی 10 و 11 و 12 بازارەکانی گیان پێشوازی لە چەند ملیۆن بەرمیل نەوتێکی ئێران بکەن لە ڕۆژانە بخرێتە بازارەکانەوە تا ئاستیەوەی نزیکەی 3 ملیۆن و 500 بەرمیل نەوتی ئێران بچێتەوە ناو بازارەکان. ئەم ئومێدە تا چەند لە جێگەی خۆیەتی تۆ پێشبینی شتێکی لەو جۆراکەی؟
So, I mean, we have already seen a big increase in exports out of Iran since the end of last year. So basically, in the 9-10 months before the US elections in 2020, we saw exports averaging around 300,000 barrels per day. So that was at a record low for Iran for that period of time, and we even reached a low of 100,000 barrels per day in the month of May 2020, which was also the impact from COVID-19. Since the election of Joe Biden, I think Iran feels a bit more emboldened and feels that it can act and produce more and export more. And so we have seen a lot more exports already from Iran. The average since the US election, since November last year, is more around 700,000 barrels per day, so more than a doubling of their exports compared to a year ago. And I think they still have capacity to increase production by about 1.7 million barrels per day, between 1.7 and 2 million barrels per day. Right now, what we are seeing at Kepler is around 700,000 barrels per day. But I think that number, you should consider it as a kind of minimum in terms of what is happening in the market, simply because of the way Iran is exporting its oil. It's very difficult for companies like us to exactly know what is happening. So the best estimate we can come up with is around a bit less than 700,000 barrels per day. But again, this is the minimum that we actually are seeing. So it could be that exports are a bit higher than this already right now.
بەڵام تا چەند تۆ پێشبینیەکەیت ینی لە کۆتایی ئەم ساڵە ئێمە بڕێکی زۆر لە نەوتی ئێران ببین لە بازارەکانی گیانە ینی تا چەند پێشبینی لە جۆراکەی بۆ نمونە 2 ملیۆن بەرمیل نەوت 3 ملیۆن بەرمیل نەوتی ئێران لە بازارەکانی گیانە کڕین و فرۆشتنی پێوە بکرێ.
So the first thing to know is that before US sanctions were reimposed under Trump, Iran exported on average around 2.5 million barrels per day of oil. So this went down to around 200 to 300,000 barrels per day under sanctions. Now we're around 700,000 barrels per day. Again, you should consider this as a minimum. It could even be higher already. When it comes to the end of the year, it depends on when sanctions on Iran will be lifted and when NIOC, the National Iranian Oil Company, will have the ability to really start boosting production even more. But I think our expectation is that a deal between Iran and the US is reached at the latest during the summer this year. And we expect Iran to reach back its full production capacity in around 6 months' time. So by the end of the year, we think that they will be at a time where they could produce around 1.7 million barrels per day more compared to what they are doing now. Now, the question relies on the demand side and on whether Iran will be able to regain market share. Now, we are not as positive as in regards to production capacity. We think it would be a little bit harder for Iran to regain market share, but for sure, we should expect a lot more Iranian oil to reach back the market again as up to 1.7 million barrels per day by the end of the year.
ڕابکێشاوە ناو پرسیارێک کە لێتی بکەم یعنی ڕووی ژێرخانی ئابووریەوە پێوتر ئینفراستراکچەر بوونەی تەحتی نەوتی ئێران تا چەند ئێستا ئامادەیە وەک باسەکرێت لە ماوەی چەند ساڵی ڕابردووە ئێران لەوە بەرهێنانی لە ژێرخانی نەوتی خۆیان نەوەستاوە بەتایبەت لەو شێڵگانەی کە هاوسنوورە لەگەڵ عێراقا ئەگەر ئێران هەر کاتێک داوای لێ بکەن بڕێکی زۆر نەوت هەناردی بازاڕەکانی ژیان بکە بە ژێرەی زانیارەکانەوە ئێران ئامادەیە ئەو زانیارانە تا چەند دروستن بەڕای بەڕێستان و شارەزای واری وزە.
NIOC and the Ministry of Oil in Iran have been working on for the past years. So they have been readying themselves for months, for even years. And they were already under sanctions between 2012 and early 2016. And they have gained a lot of experience when it comes to managing their fields under sanctions, so limiting the production from their fields. The way they do is that they shut in a few wells at a few different fields. So field A, for example, then they put them back online. They do the same at field B, then they put them back online a few weeks later, and so on and so on. So they do this at a number of fields, meaning that they have a very clear view of how the reservoir performs and how the reservoir answers to these changes in production. And they are absolutely ready to increase production. They've already started to do so. We have seen an increase of 3 million barrels in onshore storage since Nowruz. And as you know, Nowruz is the peak season for demand internally. So it means that production has already started to increase.
ئێران لە چەند ساڵی ڕابردووە لە بەدایبەتی دوای کشانی ئەمریکا لە ڕێکەوتنامەی ئەتۆمی لە ژێر فشارێکی زۆری دارایی ئابووریا بووە. بە چ داهاتێک توانیوێتی سەرمایه‌گوزاری لە سێکتەری نەوتا بکات تاوەکو ژێرخانەکەی بە تەواوەتی تێر و پڕکە بۆی بتوانێت ملیۆنان بەرمیل نەوت هەناردەی بازاڕەکانی جیان بکات. تۆ پێشبینیشتی وەک لەو جۆراکەی کە ئێران ئەو نەداهاتی هەبوو بێ بتوانێت ئەو شتە بکە؟
I think it is going to be difficult for Iran to regain its full market share, but I think the market structure of Iran's oil exports could change. So before we used to see about half of Iran's exports being sent to China and India, the other half shared between South Korea, Japan, and European countries. I think that even if sanctions are removed, we may see some European refiners and some East Asian refiners, such as Japanese and South Korean, still be a bit afraid of potential new sanctions. So I don't think it'd be as easy to regain market share from these places. But I think Iran will focus mainly on China, which has been by far its main market under sanctions, since sanctions are implemented, and potentially India and other smaller markets. But I think that for sure we should expect Iran's oil production and exports to increase, and they have a few carrots to offer these refiners, such as, for example, lower prices, or the fact that they take into account shipping costs themselves. So I think they will make use of this in order to regain as much market share as possible.
سم بۆ بکەی لەسەر ڕێکەوتنامەی نێوان تاران و پەکین باسی چین کە کڕیارێکی سەرەکی نەوتی ئێرانە ئەمە وای کردووە کە بڕێکی زۆر لە نەوتی ئێران ساغ بێتەوە لە بازاڕەکانەوە بفرۆشرێت و بازاری هەبێ بۆی ئەو نەوتی کە بەرهەمێنێ لە بازاڕەکانە ساغکرێتەوە پرسیارەکە وەیە بە چ میکانیزمێک چین لەگەڵ ئێرانە ڕێکەوتوو لە کاتێکە ئێران خۆی گەماروی لەسەرە.
I think so. As you know, China is the only country that never stopped importing Iranian oil, even when we were at the height of sanctions with Mr. Trump at the White House. And so this is likely to support the fact that China is going to be the main trading partner for Iran for its oil, and that is going to continue being the case. In regards to the other economic deals that they have signed, I think Iran is part of China's strategic plan of expanding its trading and political relations in the Middle East, also elsewhere in the world, but very importantly in the Middle East. Before sanctions were implemented, Iran represented around a 5-6% market share in China's whole oil market. Now this has come down obviously by a lot, but I think we could see Iran's market share again gain traction as the country is able to increase its exports of oil. I think Iran's relationship with China is extremely strategic for China as well, and so they are fostering relations not just with Iran but also with other countries in the Middle East in order to create a balance that benefits China.
ساری کۆتایمەگە بە کورتی وەڵامەتە سوپاس دەکەم. بازاڕەکانی جیان بەر لەوەی ڕووداوێک ڕووبدات خستنە ڕووی نەوت بێ کەمبوونەوەی یا زیادبوونی پێشتر بازاڕەکان وەڵامدانەوەیان هەیە نرخی نەوت بەرزە بێتەوە یان نزمە بێتەوە. ئەگەر زیادبوونی نەوتی ئێران لە بازاڕەکانی جیانە شتێکی نزیک بێ لە واقعەوە ئەبووایە ئێستا نرخی نەوت دابەزیایە بۆ دانەبەزیەوە بەرز بۆتەوە.
I mean, the main reason behind this is really the fact that demand is picking up a bit everywhere in the world. So in terms of oil demand, we were at around 93 million barrels per day at the beginning of this year, and expectations are that we should hit back around 99 million barrels per day by the end of this year, by the end of 2021. So part of this oil demand will need to be satisfied by more supply, mainly from OPEC Plus, which is starting to increase production in the next 3 months, and also Saudi Arabia, which is cutting its voluntary production cuts of 1 million barrels per day. But that means that there's still that gap that is to be filled by the end of the year. And so Iran will help fill that gap. So from non-OPEC, so countries such as the US, Brazil, Norway, we only expect production and exports to increase by 800,000 barrels per day. So Iran would simply help fill that gap, and the rest will be up to OPEC Plus to decide how quickly they want to bring oil production back online so as not to impact prices as much. And so that is the reason why prices have not decreased and actually have even increased. So it's really linked to demand and the success of the vaccination program in big markets.